hops on Sunday. Hops and hops. Sitting pretty on a Monday. Hops and hops. You know it's betting and beer with props and hops and props and hops.
Welcome to Between the Lines, a new addition to the Props and Hops podcast family. I'm your host, Matt Landis, joined this week by my co-host, professional bettor Fabian Sommer. Fabian, welcome to Between the Lines.
Matt, I'm absolutely stoked to be here. I'm pretty excited also about our launch today. And I can't wait to talk some football.
Right there with you. I'm excited to get into our show concept, what we'll be talking about with NFL line moves every Wednesday this season. Also, of course, using this occasion to introduce the hops to the show. But first things first, we've got an advertising partner on board with our debut episode. So I want to let everybody know that this episode is sponsored by the Power Rank Sports Betting Newsletter. Valuable, concise, and entertaining. These are Dr. Ed Fang's 3 goals with each correspondence, which mostly covers the NFL and college football. Ed is a friend of both of ours, Suma, as well as a fellow fan of craft beer and the old-fashioned. He's also a data scientist whose work has informed my betting over the years. So go ahead and check out his newsletter at thepowerrank.com and join me as a subscriber. Now, Fabian, with this being part of the Props and Hops family, there's a chance to work with you to introduce the hops in a major way. Let's kick it off by finding out what you're drinking tonight.
Today, I've got a German beer. It's called Früh Kölsch. I think Americans will probably have some issues with the Ü and the Ö. It's basically a very famous beer from the city of Cologne. And the German name of the city is Köln. And I think since the 13th century, the Kölsch gets brewed there in Cologne.
I love it. Well, I'll let you know that without the proper pronunciation, I've got a Kolsch in hand as well. Let's get this on camera here. It is called Rough Translation. It's a cheeky style Kolsch, as they dub it over at Green Cheek Beer Company in Orange, California. As the name implies, it's their best attempt at translating the Kolsch style from across the world, given that you're out in the neck of the woods of the Kolsch's birthplace in Germany. This one, really nice and refreshing, 4.6% ABV. I do get some subtle notes of fresh baked bread when I've had it in the past. Overall, though, simply light, clean, crisp, and refreshing. A perfect beer for our debut episode. It's still morning here as I'm recording out in LA. So a good breakfast beer, if you will. Suma. Cheers, man.
Cheers, man.
All right, I think this is officially the most proper note on which I've ever started a show. So let's dig in now. Tell everybody about our game plan for Between the Lines. As a programming note, you can catch us Wednesdays, mid-afternoon Eastern time, early afternoon Pacific time, most weeks of the season. And I'm guessing, Fabian, that might translate to late evening for those on Suma Standard Time.
Oh, yes, it's 8:30, or now it's 8:48 in the evening. So the show usually starts at 8:30 my time. For me, it's a pretty good time. I think for our listeners across the pond, from my point of view, it's also a pretty good time to have some good content right after lunch.
Absolutely. So we will be talking NFL line movement, looking into what's moved and why, a little reading between the lines, if you will. And for the audience, if you can read between the lines throughout these shows, odds are you'll use Fabian's insight to inform some pretty sound betting decisions. Fabian, what else do you think about the concept for Between the Lines?
Yeah, so I think our approach will be to focus on the biggest line moves that we are going to see basically a week to date, from Sunday overnight until like Wednesday when we record this show. I think as a pretty good reference, we are going to use market-making books only, like Circa, BetCris, and maybe Pinnacle. I think we should be fine with those. Those are usually the books with the highest limits and books who don't kick out any guys with a pulse. So I think that reference point from those books will be pretty good. And yeah, I mean, week one will be a little bit different this week because we had lines open for these games for like the whole summer. I think since April we have got some lines open. Even sports books like Circa opened, I think in June or July already, with 20,000 limits to start, I think, or 10,000 on spreads. And these markets have gotten shaped already a lot over the summer, but we are also seeing a lot of line moves this week, because even though there are a lot of people already betting these lines over the summer, the problem for some major groups is that they sometimes don't have the liquidity ready until week 1. I mean, college football is, I think, 2 weeks in, and lots of groups want to use their existing liquidity on college football. So there's a lot of stuff going on for why some betting groups or some bettors might not get involved before this week. We have also seen some major line moves this week from some of these said groups, where we will dive in. I think it's also important to note that we will not give out any picks on this show.
I'm just going to pause you for 1 second, because with that note, we'll let about 90% of the audience disappear.
Okay.
You said no picks, so sorry, everybody. But for those few who remain, I think there's still plenty in store. So go ahead and continue there.
Yes, we basically want to look at these major line moves every week and try to understand why the markets have moved. Like, I mean, you could also make it very easy, like, and say there are some groups, they have their models and they move their action accordingly. But I think that would be very lame. So we are going to try to think about what is the origination of some of these moves, what could be some handicapping angles, some subjective angles that the market is catching up with since the opening lines. Usually limits get raised on Tuesday and Wednesday. So on Sunday overnight and Mondays, the limits are usually pretty low, which makes it easier to move the market. And for the NFL, we pretty much always, or every week, we see the odds screen blinking from left to right on Mondays, where bettors try to catch some early numbers that seem to be off a little bit. And then on Tuesday, Wednesday, when limits get raised and when we get the first injury reports on Wednesday, we usually start to see a lot more major line moves. And what I think what's also important to note is that in the betting content world, there's often this myth going on that there is a public side and a sharp side. And we are not going to talk about public versus sharps or sharps versus square stuff, because the reality is that the public usually doesn't move lines. I mean, there are bookmakers from all the market making books and risk managers on record on several podcasts every year telling us that they move their numbers based off of sharp action, based off their sharp customer base, and they don't really care that much about recreational money. So this will not be a podcast where we talk about public versus sharps. And also in reality, it happens very often, or a lot. It happens every week in the NFL that sharps, or quote unquote sharp betting groups, can be on both sides of a certain game. That happens a lot, independent of the number. And then we also have to include the price in the thought process, because some groups might bet a game early and other groups might come back on that number later in the week when the market has moved. So that notion that there is a clear public and a clear sharp side doesn't really apply often. And very often it's the case that sharps will be on both sides of the game.
One follow-up question for you before we get into some specific games that have seen movement as we approach week 1. You talked about week 1 being a unique marketplace. The lines have been open for months, and yet we have seen a lot of movement already this week. And it hasn't been inconsequential movement. We've seen the Jaguars move through the 3 to plus 2.5 at Washington, Miami moving off the 3 to minus 3.5 hosting the Patriots. Even the Colts moving down from -8 straight to -7, another key number when we're talking about all this. So just how much weight do you put behind the fact that these numbers have been available for months versus the fact that a lot of the biggest bettors, might not be placing their bets until limits are raised when we're much closer to game time?
Well, so when we are a few weeks out from the season still, like let's say in July or August, I think BetCris had limits of like 2 to 5K on spreads and 1 to 2K on totals up until I think late August. So there are bettors who can already shape the market with like 4-figure bets in July and August, which also already gives you some direction of where a certain number might be heading to. And then when we get closer to week one, like especially this week, when limits get raised and we see a lot more money entering the market, that first of all means that some bettors are now getting involved that might not have had the liquidity beforehand. And it might also be the case that even though the early markets got shaped for 4 months now, it might not or might not have gotten shaped enough to a certain point where betting groups that come in with more liquidity now are not interested anymore. And what's also important to note is that we also have a lot more information now. We have some information. For example, today there was the news that JJ Watt is still sitting out practice with COVID. He's had COVID, I think, on August 21st, and he's still sitting out. So this is some kind of information nuggets that comes out now that also plays a major role this week.
And as we get into week one, we can start talking line movement with the first game of the season, the Thursday night opener, Bills and Rams kicking off at SoFi Stadium. And we've seen some movement on both the side and total here that I think is pretty interesting. Let's talk about the side first. The Rams opened a short favorite. Now the Bills are favored by 2.5. Sumo, what are your thoughts on the favorite flipping in this one?
Yeah, so I think the market-making books like BetCris and Circa have opened this game a little bit later than the legal sports books like DK and FanDuel. I think DraftKings opened this game at Rams -1. And then over the course of the summer, when Circa and BetCris opened, I think BetCris and Circa both opened this game at Bills -1, so already flipped through the zero. And since then, it has been mostly, I would really say, mostly one-way action. And we are now looking at, let me check the odds screen. We are mostly looking at -2 and -2.5 for the Bills across the board. I think that no matter who you talk to, no matter which sports bettor, which media outlet, everyone knows that the Buffalo Bills are the Super Bowl favorites going into the season. It seems to be the most complete team. Josh Allen is great. And the Rams have lost a step since their Super Bowl, which was not, let's say, the most exciting performance throughout the season and throughout the playoffs. So I think that the market is telling us that even though the Rams are at home, it's their raise the banner game at home on primetime, the market is still telling us that the Bills should be the better team on a neutral field and even at SoFi Stadium.
You touched on the fact that we have a lot of information now than we did when some books opened the Rams as favorites. One big piece of information has been a question mark looming over the Rams offseason and training camp, Matthew Stafford's elbow injury. Now, it sounds like he'll have no restrictions, according to Sean McVay, heading into week one. But what do you think matters more in this game when we consider Stafford's elbow for the Rams or perhaps the departure of Brian Daboll running the offense for the Bills?
I don't think it will be a major issue for the Bills because their offensive coordinator has worked, I think, for 3 years for Brian Daboll. And I don't think the offense will change all that much. I think that most of the structure will still be in place. And I'm not really worried about any play calling issues on the Bills side. Like you said, Stafford's arm looks to be completely fine. There were rumors that he might play through some pain during the season, but he already did so last season. So I think from that point of view, he should be completely fine. And what I want to add is that it's very interesting that the Bills are laying 2.5 points at SoFi Stadium in their home opener, despite being without their best cornerback. Tre'Davious White is on IR, I think, for the first 4 weeks, coming off an ACL injury. So despite all of that, the markets are telling us that up to this point, the Bills are the better team than the Rams.
And with the Bills still laying 2.5 despite the absence of Trey White, at that number, a lot of bettors would think the Rams could be a good selection as a teaser candidate this week, going up through the key numbers of 3 and 7 to plus 8.5. Can you make the case against teasing the Rams for anybody who might be looking to make that move?
I cannot really make a case against that. We are talking about a wrong teaser leg. I think the only reservation would be that we are talking about a very high total, and games with high totals have more variance, and teaser legs perform worse worth on games with very high totals. I think the usual limit is in the 47-48 range, statistically or historically speaking. So that would be my only reservation. But I mean, we're still talking about a very good team that won the Super Bowl, that has a very good offensive structure in place, that is a defense that has lost a step talent-wise, but is still filled with playmakers on all three levels. So it's hard for me, independent of the total, to make a strong case against the teaser leg.
Let's keep talking about that total. We saw it open in the range of 51.5, got as high as 52.5. We've seen some buyback. What do you make of the total right now for the season opener?
Yeah, so there wasn't really a lot of movement on the total over the summer. And then I think it was last week, there was a sharp release on the over, which pushed the over, I think, to as high as 53. And then we saw another group coming back on the under 52.5, 53, in that range. And now we are basically looking at 52 across the board. Pinnacle is under 52 minus 08. Chris is at 52 flat. Circa Colorado is one of the market lows at 51.5. It's going to be pretty interesting where that total ultimately will settle. 51 is a key number. Also going to be interesting if we see maybe some more Rams money leading up to the game. I cannot imagine this game will touch a +3 for the Rams. Even if it does, I think there will be some immediate buyback on the Rams at a +3. So I think that spread should settle somewhere in the range of minus 1.5 to minus 2.5 for the Bills.
Let's move on to the Sunday slate and talk about a week 1 divisional matchup, the Saints at the Falcons. New Orleans opened in the range of -4 at a lot of books. Currently, the line seems to be painted Saints -5.5. Now, Fabian, I thought a few weeks ago this was destined to hit 6 and maybe even cross through the 6 up to 6.5, but it seems like the market, respecting what we saw out of both Falcons quarterbacks throughout the preseason, do you think the betting market is experiencing a bit of a change of heart when it comes to the Falcons after so much of the offseason? It seemed like they were on the short list for people talking worst team in the league.
Yeah, so what's so interesting about the Falcons is that even though they might be one of the worst teams in the league, and I mean, last year they have, in terms of their win-loss record, they have overperformed. And going to the offseason, everyone was talking about the Falcons potentially being a contender for the first overall pick, and the team would be in a reset mode. But I think that at home at +6, there might be a decent buy point for a few groups out there. So I don't really think that we are going to see a market that moves to 6 and potentially settles there. So I think the Falcons at home at +6 might be a buy point for some groups. And what's interesting about the Falcons is that, I mean, their defense could be legit, be one of the worst in the league, but the offense has some variance to the upside with Marcus Mariota, who is much better with his legs than Matt Ryan was, and Arthur Smith wants to run a very play-action bootleg kind of offense. They have two playmakers with Kyle Pitts and potentially the rookie Drake London. So I can imagine a scenario in which some bettors are seeking a buy point of +6 for the Falcons here. We have only seen movement from 4.5 to 5.5 over the summer. That's not a pretty significant move because the 4 and the 5 are not spreads that have a very big value whatsoever. But I think this game being at -5.5 for the Saints on the road also tells the story that the Saints could be a pretty decent team and the Falcons could be one of the worst.
Absolutely. Well, if we want to hop from the NFC South to the AFC East, another divisional matchup that's seen some intriguing movement. The Dolphins taking some money as they prepare to host the Patriots. Miami currently laying 3.5. Now, this one opened 3, actually got bet down, was hanging out at 2.5 most of the summer. Got bet back up to -3 from Miami the Sunday morning of preseason week 3. And then yesterday, another key tick up off of the 3 to Dolphins -3.5. What do you make of the roller coaster ride it's been for the point spread in this Patriots-Dolphins week 1 matchup?
Yeah, so like you have explained, earlier in the summer, it was a very soft 3 at some books. Then we saw a downtick to 2.5. And then I think since 2 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks ago, it's been one-way action all the way. I have not seen anyone either on gambling Twitter or anyone that I know that has played the Patriots so far, which is pretty interesting. At -2.5, we saw several groups and several sharp dudes releasing the Dolphins, betting the Dolphins at -2.5, -110, -2.5, 120. Then I think on Tuesday morning, a major group laid all the 3s that were still in the marketplace at -3 flat, bringing that line towards -3.5. And I cannot disagree with that move at all. I think we have some uncertainty with the Dolphins when we talk about how good can Tua Tagovailoa actually be in his 3rd year with a much better supporting cast and maybe a much better coaching staff. There's uncertainty about Mike McDaniel. There's uncertainty about the ceiling of their offensive line, even though they added left tackle Teron Armstead. But I think, and this is why I think the market has moved entirely on the Dolphins, is that there's like nothing positive coming out of Patriots camp. I think the Patriots could be one of the worst defenses in the league this year, or at least one of the worst defenses in Bill Belichick's era. And when I look at this matchup, I mean, bettors probably have to ask themselves, do the Patriots have the bodies on their defense to cover Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle? And if the answer is no, it probably makes sense to lay the 3 with the Dolphins earlier this week. And coming back to that uncertainty, there's also uncertainty with the Patriots because Josh McDaniels is gone. And now we have Matt Patricia. Sorry, I have to laugh about this. We have Matt Patricia and Joe Judge working on the offense, installing a new scheme, a completely new run blocking scheme from what the Patriots have run for like 10 to 20 for the past 10 years under Josh McDaniels. And every beat reporter has said that they have some tremendous issues, that the offense is not clicking already, that they might need some time early in the season. And from that perspective, I think that move up to -3.5 makes completely sense.
I think that last point also ties in with some movement we've seen on the total for this game. Our mutual friend Adam Chernoff is the one who I've seen making the most noise about the fact that the Patriots essentially eliminated the fullback position from their roster. So on one hand, we've got Matt Patricia and Joe Judge, of all people, commanding an NFL offense by the looks of it. And on the other hand, it could be a much more pass-heavy Patriots offense this season after Mac Jones showed quite a bit of promise in his rookie year. That plus what you talked about with Tua maybe making that year 3 leap has led to a lot of action on the over in this game. What do you make of that movement on the total? I'll let you take a sip first.
No problem. The total was, I think it opened as early as 44 early in the summer. Then Adam Chernoff was also part of bringing this total up to 46.5, and I think it was as high as 47. Mm-hmm. And then we saw some buyback, I think, which I can understand because at 47, the market has touched a key number. And to be honest, at 47, I can understand that some people come back on that game playing the under. Because when I think about that matchup, and when we also combine or include the information that there are some very sharp people out there that have already bet the Dolphins through the key number of 3 towards -3.5. I think there's a scenario in this game where the Dolphins are good on offense, and at some point the game script gets extremely tough for the Patriots. And then I think, as an overbetter, you have to ask yourself the question: can the Dolphins defense, can the Patriots offense keep up and keep scoring against that Mike McDaniel offense that might be very clever at running the ball in the fourth quarter?
Well, from one AFC divisional matchup to another, our third straight division matchup in week 1 to kick off this show, and we're not done yet. Heading up to the AFC South, Indianapolis traveling to Houston, another game with side and total movement in recent days. The side was pretty much painted Colts -8 for about 4 months, and we saw it go straight down to 7 yesterday. Didn't even really blink at 7.5. Why do you think that was, and what do you make of that move?
That was exactly one very, very big betting group where that move originated, that basically cleared house and took all the 8s and all the 7.5s on the Texans yesterday and brought this down to 7. It was really, like you said, it was painted at 8 all the way. And then it was one group yesterday catching the home dog over a touchdown.
And when I see this line stuck at 7 now, I wonder if it might be a bit of a wet blanket for teaser bettors. Oftentimes, it's discussed about the value in teasing through 7 rather than starting at 7 and teasing down to 1. Also, with road favorites, that can be a little bit dicey when we're talking about teasers. So when we are talking about teams that a lot of bettors will look to tease in week 1, any advice from you as a professional bettor to people considering teasing the Colts at the Texans?
Yeah, so when it comes to teasing, yes, we always want to go through the 7 and through the 3. And now we always have to incorporate the concept of closing line value. So some might think, okay, then I have to wait until game time. I need to know where the line settles. And if it settles at 8, I can tease it down to -2. But what's even better is if you think the Colts are the side here and you want to include the Colts in one of your teasers, you would want to get it now at -1, and you want that number to get better in your favor. So let's say you take the Colts now at -1. That's not technically a wrong teaser leg, but if you think the Colts close at -8, for example, you would have made a teaser leg that's not technically a wrong teaser leg, but it has a lot of closing line value. So, which makes it still a very, very good bet. So, the most optimal way is that you get a teaser, place a good bet that closes higher at what you got earlier in the week.
And I know we haven't talked about this previously, but I would bet that if you were to guess, if you were told this game doesn't close Colts -7, probably a good bit more likely it goes back up to 7.5 rather than down to 6.5. Does that sound right to you?
I think so. I can really see that the game coming off the 7. When we also think about last year, I could be wrong on this, but I think last year between the two teams, we were talking about spreads in the 9 to 10 range, or let's say 8 to 10 range. So I think last year the spreads closed higher than what we are seeing now for this matchup. And then you have to think about, depending on what side you want to bet, what has changed since then. The Texans, they are much healthier on the offensive line. Davis Mills is entering his second year. Quarterbacks usually make a significant jump going into year 2. But the Colts also have a much better quarterback than last year. They have some new pieces on defense. They also have a new defensive coordinator. They're going to play a new scheme. But you have to weigh these things against one another and think about, is this adjustment from last season? We can always reference to past games because things change over time. But I think, in my opinion, it's an interesting thought process. So when we saw a spread of 9 or 9.5 or 10 last season, and now it's 7, do all the offseason changes warrant that line move down to 7? And when you think they don't, you might want to grab the Colts. And if you think they do, you still might be interested in some Texans +7, or if you think that there is going to be some buyback on the Colts, you might want to grab the Texans later in the week.
And if you think the side is right at this stage, it might also behoove bettors to look at the total. You mentioned Davis Mills, some optimism perhaps for the Texans offense. Andy's defense, some question marks after some changes during the offseason. And offensively, it's pretty much, I think, a unanimous agreement across the betting marketplace that Matt Ryan represents an upgrade over what the Colts got from Carson Wentz last season. And part of that could be explained by what we've seen with this total, opening at 44, getting as high as 47, now settling for the most part right around 46. What do you make of the movement we've seen on the total for this one between the Colts and Texans?
Yeah, the pretty interesting movement. There was a release. I think it was also our friend Adam who released the over on Houston and Indianapolis. Then it got as high as 47, as you mentioned, and since then it's pretty much been one-way action. And again, I think that the fact that this game touched the key number of 47 was probably a pretty good buy point for some bettors and some groups out there to get the under. I think if you want to bet the over, let's say at the current number, I don't have a strong opinion on that total at all. But if I would attack this specific market, I would think about, do the Texans have enough firepower to score on that Colts defense? Or do they have enough firepower to score late in the game if the Colts jump out to a lead? Because the Colts, they are -7 on the road for a reason. So the game script that we have to anticipate is that the Colts are going to be leading in this game. And if the Colts offense is clicking, they also have a lot of ingredients to just kill the clock later in the second half, run the ball, play that smash mouth, spread power ball that Frank Reich loves to play. The Texans defense is not very good at all. So there could be a scenario in which the Colts jump out to a lead. And then you have to ask yourself the question, do the Texans have enough on offense to throw the ball when the Colts defense knows what's coming?
A lot to consider from a game script standpoint when we're looking at a spread in this range. We can move on to a game with a tighter point spread right now involving another AFC South team. The Jaguars heading to Washington to take on the Commanders. It's going to take a bit of time to get used to saying Washington Commanders, but got it right the first time around. The Jags down to +2.5. This one opened 3.5. I saw it get as high as +4.5 for Jacksonville during the offseason. In late August, we saw a move come in, bringing this number down from 3.5 to 3. Yesterday, another big tick down off the 3 to +2.5. Now, I know Chase Young is out. I know a lot of people think Trevor Lawrence can thrive in year 2 under Doug Peterson with some competent coaching. Why else do you think we've seen such a strong move in favor of the Jags when we look at the side here?
I just think that there is too much optimism in the marketplace for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They got hyped all off season, and I think also for a reason, because when you go from that complete mess of a coaching disaster, what Urban Meyer was last year, just going to Doug Peterson, who has won a Super Bowl 5 years ago and represents what I would call at least competent coaching, I think. And then you have to combine it with a quarterback that was touted like as the next Andrew Luck, as a generational talent. I think last year you saw some of the high marks for Trevor Lawrence. He was just put in a bad position. So I think if the market believes that this is going to be a different Jacksonville Jaguars team, and a team that's going to be significantly improved from last year, Trevor Lawrence going into his second year under Doug Peterson, they have some new playmakers. Their defensive front looked kind of promising during the preseason. So from that perspective, I think I completely understand that move. Washington Commanders, I mean, it's Carson Wentz, and we have no clue how that's going to play out. There's always a lot of variance in his game. I don't think you want him to be like that game manager that the Colts tried for some parts last season. I think you have to ride that peak Carson Wentz variance, where he can have some of these games where he just throws some bombs down the field and is very good on third down. And I think that's what you have to ride. And then if you match that up against each other, I can totally understand why the market has a lot more optimism on the Jaguars at 3, or had a lot more optimism at 3 or 3.5 than they had for the Washington Commanders laying a field goal at home.
You touched on a lot of the unknown with Carson Wentz, and knowing that he's such a high variance quarterback, I feel like we might have an odd degree of familiarity in this one at the same time, considering Doug Peterson was once his coach in Philadelphia, and the Jags were the last team to face Carson Wentz when they beat the Colts in Week 18 last season. What do you make of any edges that might give the Jaguars defense against a new-look Washington offense?
I think that's very, very hard to quantify because we don't have a lot of data on that stuff. It's not pretty common that we have a quarterback in week 1 playing against his former coach, and the same two teams going up against each other after they did last year in week 17. We also have a whole new coaching staff for the Jaguars. So it's very hard to quantify. I think if you combine that subjectively for a little bit and say, okay, that little angle might be something that pushes me over the edge and makes me bet the Jaguars for that specific reason. I think I would not say you should not apply it, but in general, it's very, very hard to quantify these things.
Got it. Well, another move that's been tough for me to quantify recently can take us to the late window of games on Sunday of week 1. Let's talk Chiefs Cardinals. Kansas City up to -6, and this line was at 3. It sat there for more than 3 months. It was even shaded toward 2.5 at one point, and we saw this line move from 3.5 up to 4.5 at about this time last week. Then we saw another power move from 4.5 up to 6 yesterday. Why do you think that is, and what do you think the ceiling is for this point spread?
I think the ceiling is 6. I think that I would be really surprised if we saw some 6.5s popping later in the week. I think +6 for the Cardinals at home is a pretty solid buy point for some people out there. It was Tuesday morning, where a sharp group moved the Chiefs from -4, -4.5 up to -6. I think there's not a lot of love for the Cardinals in the marketplace right now. Their defense could be really bad this year. J.J. Watt, like I mentioned earlier, is still sitting out practice with his COVID absence in August. So there might be a chance that J.J. Watt is not going to play, and he's like arguably their best player left, and even he is still a little bit on the decline in recent years. So I think people who bet the Chiefs up to -6 are just saying the Cardinals are not a great team early in the season. They are without Andrew Hopkins. Zach Ertz is still holding out of practice. Maybe he might not play or end up playing on Sunday. And the Chiefs are still the Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes and Reed, aside of Tyreek Hill, nothing or not a lot has really changed. And I think this is a very bad matchup for the Cardinals defense. And I can understand why teams are trying to fade them in week 1 against the Chiefs.
I think you caught yourself there. You said the Chiefs are still the Chiefs, and then you noted that Tyreek Hill has left that offense, and that's probably a pretty significant departure in the eyes of many who would be looking the Cardinals' way at this stage. What do you think of the Chiefs offense entering the season without Tyreek Hill and with some other new faces replacing him at wide receiver?
I think they will be completely fine. Yes, losing Tyreek Hill is a pretty big deal, but I also think we have to give Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes the benefit of the doubt that they will figure it out. And what's so funny is that, Matt, last season there was all the talk about the Chiefs, like they are struggling against too high. Mahomes is not himself anymore. So many turnovers, and I think the Chiefs had the 7th most turnovers on offense in the entire league. They only had 1 fewer turnovers than the New York Jets, which is pretty amazing to think about. And they struggle against all these too high shells early in the season. And despite all of that, despite all the turnovers, despite all the struggling against too high, I think they still finished as the number 1 offense in EPA per play in the regular season and the playoffs. So I think that offense will be completely fine. And even last season, they figured it out on the fly. From weeks 10 to week 18, the Chiefs had the lowest average depth of targets. So Mahomes was attempting the lowest air yards per throw, but the Chiefs had the highest or third or second highest yards after the catch per play. So they were basically saying, okay, we cannot get all these or all our explosive plays because teams are taking them away. So let's change the offense a little bit. Let's throw it short and let's create lots of great windows for our receivers to run after the catch. And from week 10 on, they were the number one offense in EPA per dropback. So I really trust that coaching staff to figure it out without Tyreek Hill.
So you think the Chiefs are going to be just fine? And in our next game, we can talk about a couple of offenses that people also probably think are going to be just fine, but that might not necessarily be the case right out of the gates with some new players, personnel-wise for the Packers, coaching-wise for the Vikings. And when it comes to this line, we've seen an opener as high as 50 at one of the sharpest books in the world, down as low as 46.5 at one point. We have seen it come up a bit, settling in around 47. What do you make of the total movement we've seen in Packers Vikings?
Yes, I know from some sharp bettors that were taking the unders on Green Bay and Minnesota earlier in August, I think in early August, and then in mid-August, they were taking some of the 49s out there in the marketplace. Then at some point it was down to 48. And then I think this week we also saw a release on the under, which drove the market down even further to, as you mentioned, as low as 46.5, I think. And now we have some buyback on the over. And again, it's the key number 47. So a back and forth. And again, sharp people are going to bet both sides of a total and both sides of a game. Some have under 49, under 48.5, under 48 in their pockets, and some will have over 46.5 and over 47. So it's a pretty interesting back and forth. I think I can understand the early movement on the under because we are talking about a Packers offense that is without Devontae Adams. And I think that matters a little bit more than Tyreek Hill matters for the Chiefs because Devontae Adams was just like such a crazy focal point of the offense. I think Aaron Rodgers said in some interview over the summer that basically every passing play started with where is Devontae Adams lined up. So this is going to be a pretty dramatic shift for the offense. Alan Lazard might also not play this week. We didn't know that before this week, but the Vikings have a new coaching staff, a new offensive scheme. The Packers defense got better. The Packers offense might struggle a little bit early in the season. So I think that's the rational thought process behind people betting that under earlier this summer.
You've touched on it a couple of times now during the course of this show, 47 being a key number when we're talking totals. I think it's much more widely known that numbers like 3 and 7 are really important as we talk sides. And when it comes to totals, especially as the league has seen a higher scoring environment in recent years, could you just share some context as to what you consider some of the key numbers around totals when you're considering as a pro how to bet on overs or unders?
Yeah, so over the past couple of seasons, I think the average scoring total for NFL games is right around somewhere 47, 47 point something, I think. Yeah, so key numbers for totals are like 44, 47, 51 nowadays. 51 got, let's say, more keyish over recent years with an uptick in scoring and uptick in passing efficiency. We see more games going or being a very high total. So 51 has gotten more important in recent years. On low scoring games, we have key numbers of 41, for example, 43 a little bit, 44, like 24-20 is a score that's not very seldom. Yeah, and over the years, with an uptick in scoring, uptick in passing efficiency, the value of the key numbers has shifted a little bit towards the upper side. So 47 and 51 got a little bit more important in recent years.
All right. And Suma, as you talk about 51 being a key number these days, that transitions us perfectly to the final game we'll talk about on this first episode of Between the Lines, the Sunday night season opener, the Bucs at the Cowboys. That total sitting at 51 right now at some books, sitting at 50.5 at some others. And we had a market maker open at 50 53. We've seen it go down to 50, now coming back up again. And this has been another roller coaster ride of a market. The Bucs offensive line beleaguered. Tom Brady left the team for a while during training camp, and then seemingly as soon as he came back into the fold, the Cowboys had some key injuries on their offensive line and now also at wide receiver. So what do you make of where the total stands right now, just a few days out from the Bucs and Cowboys kicking off on Sunday night?
Yeah, I don't think that the opener was wrong or was completely off in any way or shape. I think based on what we saw last season, that matchup had the potential to be very high scoring. But over the summer, like every single news on these two teams was pointing towards the under. Like Dallas losing Amari Cooper, Dallas losing James Washington in the offseason, then Tyron Smith at some point. And on the Bucs, you already mentioned it, like their O-line issues, especially on the interior. They are starting their, I think, third string center now. And Chris Godwin might be still out for this game. They lost Antonio Brown already at some point last season. They will be without Rob Gronkowski. So, like every news on this team, maybe aside from the Julio Jones news, who might be, when healthy, be a very, very valuable asset for this offense. So has pointed towards this game not necessarily be a very high scoring game. So I completely understand and agree with the move down through the number of 51. And now we have seen this game ticking up a little bit towards, I think Pinnacle is showing 50 and a half. Chris is showing 51, shade a little bit towards the over. Circa Las Vegas, Circa Colorado, also 51. And it will be interesting to see where that number will ultimately settle. Will it be below the key number? Will it be above the key number? I think there were some pretty strong stances from some sharp bettors earlier this summer on the under. So I cannot really see, or let's say I can rather see that game coming down again towards 50 and a half, rather than it climbing towards 51 and a half again.
One question I'd like to throw your way that might lend itself just a bit to an over. You touched on the Bucs offensive line being beat up, but specifically on the interior. And throughout Tom Brady's career, I've heard over and over again that the thing that bothers him most is pressure up the middle. Now, if we look at this matchup with the Cowboys, it seems like their pass rush excels most along the edges, especially with Micah Parsons being such a revelation last year in his rookie season. So what do you make of the fact that, yes, the Bucs offensive line is probably going to be vulnerable up the middle, but that doesn't necessarily play to the Cowboys' strength as a pass rushing unit?
Yes, you're completely right. And this will be very fascinating and probably the most important matchup to watch. Like, how is Dan Quinn going to scheme up pressure up the middle? Like, is he going to blitz a lot? Is he calling some sim pressures to play around a little bit with that third string center? And what he could also do is, like, yes, Micah Parsons, I expect him to play a lot more on the edges, but I can also see like Dan Quinn using Micah Parsons as a pass rusher or a blitzer up the middle on like key passing downs. And that will be interesting to see, because I don't think that interior offensive line will be able to handle Micah Parsons as a rusher up the middle.
All right, I think that's about all the guidance we can provide at this stage of week 1 in the NFL. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. For the audience listening or watching this, you can find Fabian on Twitter at Suma810. That's SUUMA 810. And also elsewhere on the Hammer Betting Network, Mondays, look out for his article at thehammer.bet outlining his top takeaways from the Sunday slate. And that article series is going to debut this coming Monday, September 12th. You can find me on Twitter at mlandis18, also hosting the Props and Hops flagship episode on Fridays throughout the season with new co-host, another pro bettor, the Hitman. And for those of you who know Hitman's work, you can bet safely that he's going to bring the props to Props and Hops in a major way. If you'd like to keep up with all things happening across the Hammer, follow at the Hammer HQ on Twitter and check us out at www.thehammer.bet. thanks again to everybody for tuning in. I'll see you again Friday with the Hitman for the season debut of Props and Hops. All right, but Suma, as far as our first episode of Between the Lines goes, it's been an absolute blast doing this with you. Look forward to doing it again every Wednesday throughout the season. And once again, cheers, man.
Cheers, Matt. Can't wait for next week.